director for the Disability Resource Center, and is now reporting up through access and equity. So we have a wonderful view of accessibility, compliance, culture, and such for all of our faculty, staff, students with disabilities. So thank you for joining us to hear about these changes and updates and so forth. We're excited to be here with you all. So we are, as the agenda shows, going to give you an overview of what access and equity does in the world of compliance with the ADA. Sophia is going to talk about the Disability Resource Center, the context for our work, and we're both going to talk about our accommodation process, how we review and implement these things, and then we'll talk a little bit about future goals that resides on our agenda going forward. There we go. Okay, so so the Office for Access and Equity, as many of you know and have worked with us in the past, is the office charged with the responsibility of assuring compliance for faculty and staff with state and federal anti-discrimination laws. All of these are, OAE is charged with the facilitation of reasonable accommodations and interactive processes for employees and students pursuant to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Illinois Human Rights Act, and our employment accommodation policy. So under these federal and state regulations, we have these laws that guide us with compliance, but we also have, and we're going to talk a little bit about the non-discrimination statement and the process around our employment accommodation policy and procedures. So we are responsible for coordinating and issuing official responses to claims of discrimination by students, faculty, and staff, both internally and externally, which really means that any one of the constituents on this campus, faculty, staff, and students, if they feel that they are in a hostile environment in their classroom or in their employment setting, that's where we start to get into the discrimination allegations. The goal of today is really to talk more about the accommodations, but I put that out there. And we have a couple slides as we move forward. Here is just for your review, and many of you probably know that the university has a non-discrimination statement, and you will read in here the protected classifications that are included in that non-discrimination, of which disability is one. And again, really, this is the statement that access and equity lives in the world of disability, accessibility, discrimination, and accommodation. So it basically, when you break down this statement, it's really about our system, the University of Illinois system, because this is a system statement out of the president's office that goes down into each campus, Chicago, Champaign, and Springfield, and this guides a system-wide effort to make a commitment to the most fundamental principles of academic freedom, equality of opportunity, and human dignity. And it also helps us with decisions involving students and employees based on individual merit and are free from invidious discriminations in all its form. And then it also reflects and incorporates the laws, which I just discussed a little bit, and the protected classifications there. And then I think it's important to know that this policy applies to admissions decisions, our employment environments, access to and treatment in university programs and activities, as well as applicants, employee applicants for the university, which we will talk a little bit about. So we're going to start with just kind of an overview of our employee and graduate assistant accommodations. And what you see before you here is the employment accommodation policy is on the left side of your screen, and the accommodation form is on the right side of the screen. So the policy governs our actual process and our form. So what I want to do is proceed to the next slide to kind of talk about what this form looks like in its implementation and how what process we go through when, and I want you to pay careful attention that the header on this screen is about employee and graduate assistants, because sometimes people, as we all know, grad assistants are also students. And this is where, Sophia and Office, the DRC and OEE may sometimes overlap when we're evaluating graduate assistants, where they need accommodation for themselves in the classroom, and they may need accommodation as to be able to perform the essential functions of their job as a graduate assistant. So we have to balance those two things carefully. And I think it's really important that we begin to really acknowledge that. And OEE has found it very worthwhile to make that note now in presentations, to be sure that people know that grad assistants are also employees and should go through this process if necessary. So here's what the interactive process really looks like. Under federal and state laws, you have to have an interactive process amongst all the constituents involved in the employee accommodation process, or applicant. So you'll see, first and foremost, the interactive process requires that an applicant of the university or an employee, faculty or staff, make a disclosure and a request. You're going to see a very similar process with the DRC, because it's something that we're both doing, and we're all looking at accommodation and what is a fair assessment of accommodation for students, and a fair assessment for employees, faculty and staff. So and I thank Sophia for coming up with this actual chart, because this chart is a way to visualize both accommodation processes for employees and students. So, but for employees, for the purposes of employees today, this in my segment, employees first have to go through University Health Services if, in fact, the disability is not observable. Okay, so once we identify the need to verify the condition, okay, that's where we start with, right? And so you go to University Health, and then they do an assessment there. Dr. Martyr and his staff are essential to this process and work very closely with Access and Equity, because our goal here is to keep employees' records confidential, private, their medical records, and their requests around their medical condition confidential and private. That's key to our process, um, and and so once we have University Health Services approval, or they check off the box, must consider that an accommodation be granted, then we move then into the department head supervisor segment of review. And here's where the job function, right, is critical to looking at the job description, to understand the essential functions of the job, to make sure that now we have a condition validated. Now we have the department head and the supervisor saying, okay, let's now look to see what the request is. Is it reasonable? Keyword under the law. Is it reasonable to grant such an accommodation based on the essential functions of the job? Because employees have to be able to do the essential functions of the job, but if there's an accommodation that can help them do it, then that's what we're trying to strive for. And then lastly, OEE does sign off and approve the accommodation. And really, Access and Equity can be involved at any point in this process. The only time that we ask individuals that are reviewing these accommodations is not to deny an accommodation without consulting with us. because in certain cases, it could be construed as potentially discriminatory, and we want to be, ensure that proper review has been done in this process. So we are sometimes on the front end, we're sometimes in the middle, we're sometimes at the end, but we want to be sure, and even an employee can enter this process at any point. An employee can come, to their department head supervisor first, and then as long as we're getting all three of these entities weighing in, that's what this process is all about. So here are some types of reasonable accommodations that vary, again, depending upon it's a case by case, individualized need assessment of the applicant or employee. And here, what you see are, these are more of the common, it could be a stand-up desk. It could be a chair, a certain chair, some sort of ergonomic assessment that would help the employee perform better. And that's a reasonable accommodation that can be made. You'll see in the modified work sites, we're seeing more modified work schedules, which are a little more complicated. And really, there's a great deal of assessment that has to go in to whether or not someone can perform essential job functions at home for a day or two, whatever the request might be. But a lot of assessment goes into that process as well. So these are just some examples of what that looks like. What's important here also is to just touch upon the tenure rollback policy for faculty, and to be sure that if somebody is requesting a tenure rollback, that indeed, if it's based on a medical condition, and that's the key here, if it's based on a medical condition, then a faculty member has to go through this process to validate that the tenure rollback is an accommodation based on a medical concern. And then in this particular process, the provost does weigh in on an approval through the tenure rollback process. And so this is just important because sometimes these requests also come in, so it's good to touch on. So in summary, here's the takeaway is the university has a legal obligation to provide reasonable accommodations based on disability. We do have in here medical condition, pregnancy, and religion. Some of these other ones are other processes, but it's important to make sure that we have to offer reasonable accommodations based on any one of these areas. And that OAE facilitates the interactive process to review, approve, and implement reasonable accommodation requests as we've just gone through that process. So one of the things and this is my last slide, and I'm going to let Sophia jump in here, but with OAE and the DRC working together, and this alignment has been so instrumental in my vision, and I think the vision of both Sophia and myself to really begin to think about this campus in a much broader way, and to think about accessibility needs and barriers that even don't rest on her plate, on Sophia's plate, but that we recognize through students and employees that there's a need for coordination of ADA barriers and access issues. So I have begun a review of an ADA coordinator position, which is in the very early stages, but we have human resources at the moment is evaluating a job description for this individual. And there are many things that I think we have to come together on the overall campus that needs a huge amount of coordination by one individual. So we're excited about that. It's going to be the first time we've ever really as a campus had this position. And so please, if you know, we'll watch for the websites and the job boards for this position. We have also are looking at an assistant director for digital accessibility and making sure that this is an area that is we really need to take a much closer look at on the campus. Unfortunately, our searches for this have been difficult, and so we are trying again for yet another search with this position. Now, I just, for those of you on this call, Cynthia Herrera Lindstrom and I will be co-supervising this individual, so they will have a place at the table at ACCC's staff meetings and my staff meetings and Sophia's. So just putting that out there as something to share. And then ultimately we'll be creating an ADA advisory committee that will be up underneath an ADA coordinator to begin to look at centralized reporting in areas of ADA compliance that are beyond accommodations, right? Accommodations have a place, but we really need to start to look at some of the other aspects of the campus. So I believe that concludes my portion of the presentation. Sophia?
Caryn, I will dive in and talk a little bit more specifically about the Disability Resource Center and what we do. So first, we are located over in the Student Services building on the first floor. We now, and I'll speak excitedly on this more soon, but have one staff member who's also located on West Campus to serve most of our health science and sort of clinically focused programs. And I do always like to point out that students can go through our entire process digitally / over the phone. So if a student ever faces barriers to physically coming to our location, we can take them through the entire intake process that I will describe later remotely. Okay, I think we've covered most of this, but just so we're all on the same page, the Disability Resource Center handles student accommodations and resource referrals, awareness and outreach as it pertains to student access. The Office for Access and Equity handles employee accommodations, as Caryn mentioned. That does mean that there are students who are also employees who might work with both of us should they need accommodations for both their academics and their employment. OAE handles discrimination complaints and Title IX, which I point out because technically pregnancy is not covered by the ADA. It's not considered a disability, but rather it's covered by Title IX. So if someone is a student or an employee and needs accommodations for pregnancy, we would have them go directly to OAE. I also want to point out that we have a very, very exciting center on campus. This happened a couple of years ago, I think, when the DRC sort of branched out of Office of Diversity and now reports to the Office of Access and Equity. In the Office of Diversity, there was created a Disability Cultural Center, and it's one of the 7 centers for cultural understanding and social change. It is very exciting because while there is an office like the Disability Resource Center at basically every college or university in the United States by law, there are, I want to say, 5 or fewer disability cultural centers in the entire country that are actually fully staffed. So this is a very exciting move on the part of UIC to really embrace disability as an aspect of diversity. So sometimes you get confused with the DCC. They're over in ESB. We work with them a lot. They do more of the sort of disability arts and activism, programming, focusing on community building and disability as identity and a point of pride. So we do collaborate with them a lot, but we tend to be more of the accommodations piece, and they're more of the sort of cultural and identity piece. So as Caryn already alluded to, there are 2 really heavy hitter sort of federal laws that come into play when we're talking about accommodating students with disabilities at the college level. And those are Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act from the 1970s and the Americans with Disabilities Act, commonly called the ADA, which was passed in 1990, amended in 2008. I always like to point out, because I think it's important, that these were both passed as a result of civil unrest and protest, meaning a legislator didn't wake up one morning and decide to be good to people with disabilities. It was people with disabilities organizing and getting together, and through civil disobedience in a lot of cases, sort of demanding rights that these pieces of legislation were fought for and won. So they do provide different legal protections than the laws that protect K through 12 students, which I point out because we know we have a lot of students who are transitioning directly from high school into college, and the paradigm's a little different. So whereas at the high school level, a lot more responsibility is on the school, both to identify whether a student has a disability and to do everything in their power to provide equal success. At the college level, a lot of that responsibility shifts onto the student to disclose, to identify that they need assistance, and it is really our responsibility as an institution to provide equal access, which is a little different. If there are barriers to that access, that is our job through the Disability Resource Center and in collaboration with offices like OBE and with faculty and staff to ensure that those barriers are removed and there's an equal playing field, equal access for those students. Ultimately, they both provide students with disabilities from discrimination, exclusion, denial of educational benefits, and they support what we'll talk about further soon, which are reasonable accommodations. So really quickly, I like to talk about, and I think we've probably used this word multiple times already, but how do we define disability? When I keep saying disability, what do I mean? So we've spoken about the legal framework, and this language here is actually directly from the Americans with Disabilities Act, defining disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life function. The original ADA lists a long list of major life functions. When they revamped it in 2008, they added even more major life functions. I think the real key takeaway here is that it is a very broad definition. And we want employees to understand this, but we also really want students to understand this, because sometimes we hear students come in and say things like, you know, I don't have a disability, I just have diabetes. Or I'm not disabled, I have generalized anxiety disorder, because those sort of conditions, chronic health conditions or mental health conditions, are maybe not considered by that to be disabilities, or they don't consider themselves to be an individual with a disability, when in fact, chronic health conditions and mental health conditions are certainly protected under the law, and those students do or potentially could qualify for reasonable accommodations at the college level. So that's really important takeaway from the legal framework. I also like to point out that there, within the past 10 or 20 years, has been a real paradigm shift away from what's called the medical model of disability to what's known as the social model of disability. The difference being that the medical model really locates disability within a person, considers it to be a diagnosis or a problem that needs to be fixed or cured. So the sort of ideal in this situation would be that we find a cure for whatever is quote unquote wrong with someone who is disabled. Whereas the social model of disability moves the locus of disability out of that specific person and into the environment, considering that environmental barriers, attitudinal barriers, societal barriers can be disabling for someone and can, to a large extent, create or exacerbate disability. The sort of go-to example for this, because it's so sort of concrete, so it's easiest to visualize, I think, is if we imagine a wheelchair user approaching a set of stairs, the medical model of disability might look at that situation and say, well, the problem here is, you know, the person maybe can't use their legs, and if they had better prosthetics, or if we used better stem cell research, we could fix their problem and get them to walk up those stairs. Whereas the social model of disability would look at that situation and say, you know, the fact that this person uses a wheelchair is part of their identity, probably means that they have a perspective that is valuable and unique and important to a larger diverse conversation in an institution or on a campus. And the issue here clearly is the stairs. Stairs are a disabling sort of design feature for a lot of people. So I say all that to say, in the Disability Resource Center, we rely frequently on all three of these definitions of disability. So we're here for compliance reasons. We are legally mandated to do the work that we do. We haven't completely sort of abandoned the medical model in the sense that we do ask for some kind of medical documentation. We want some kind of clinical take on what the disability is and how it might affect a student in an academic setting. But ultimately, what we're doing is trying to determine what are the barriers in the environment or in classroom materials or in the way that tests are given, for example, that are providing a non-equal access situation for the student in their campus life, and what kind of accommodations can we put in place that will remove those barriers and restore that equal access to that student. Real quick plug about the idea of universal design. If you're interested, this is something that DRC trains on separately because it's kind of a big idea, but an exciting one. If you're thinking to yourself, why don't we just create environments that don't have any barriers? That's a terrific point. And that is, in essence, the concept of universal design. And in fact, the concept of universal design posits further that by creating materials and curricula and spaces and online interfaces without barriers, it benefits not only folks with disabilities, but sort of everyone who encounters those different environments. So something to think about and look into. Okay, so I think with that framework in mind, reasonable accommodations can then be considered processes or services, or in some cases gadgets or different testing environments that are designed to remove barriers to access. They are not an advantage. They're about removing disadvantage and equaling out the playing field. So I won't read all of these, but testing accommodations are our most common accommodation. We do things for access, relocating classrooms to make sure that students are able to access their classrooms, providing support for peer note-taking, assistive technology and software, which is sort of gadgets for software that helps students to read or write or take notes, as well as ensuring equal access to dorms and transportation, and in some cases asking for reasonable flexibility with policies such as attendance and deadline policies. What reasonable accommodations are not, they are not of a personal nature, meaning we don't provide things like personal care attendants, wheelchairs, walkers, glasses. We can help students to find those resources, but we in the DRC only provide academic accommodations. Reasonable accommodations cannot pose a direct threat to the student or others, which might not come up very often, but potentially if you think about a healthcare setting, maybe a patient care setting, it's possible that there might be some risky situations that we need to navigate. And it cannot significantly alter the curriculum, or what we call the essential elements of a course. And this goes back to the fact that they're not an advantage. So we can't change what's required of a student with a disability. Students with disabilities are not getting special classes tailor-made for them, or degrees that have different requirements. Everyone has to meet the same requirements, take the same tests, etc. But by changing maybe the timing, or by changing certain deadlines, for example, or certain parameters, we're able to remove those barriers. So that being said, determining whether an essential element is being altered has to be based on the actual curriculum, not speculation or generalizations about the field or the real world. So saying something like, you know, in the real world, biologists have to think quickly on their feet, so it doesn't make sense to give this person extra time in their biology class, would not be considered a reasonable justification for denying an accommodation. And they can really only be denied after a fact-based and this is the key word here, collaborative process, meaning if you are ever in a situation where you fear that an accommodation is changing the essential elements of your course, the first step should always be to reach out to the Disability Resource Center and engage in this interactive process so that we can determine with you whether something needs to be changed or altered in the accommodation so that it is not changing the essential elements of your course, rather than unilaterally denying an accommodation or telling a student that you cannot or will not provide it. This will look very familiar because it is very similar to the employee accommodation process. Basically, the student discloses and requests, goes through an interactive process with us. We provide what's called a letter of accommodation, which is actually a PDF file that we send to the student that they then will send to their instructors for implementation if there are any issues with implementation. As I just mentioned, we strongly encourage and ask faculty to re-engage with us, to re-engage in the interactive process. So that's why it's iterative. And if there do need to be any changes or any facilitation in terms of implementing the accommodations, we are more than happy to help with that. It is important to notice that there is an on-ramp, so disclosure and request is the on-ramp to this process, meaning if students do not disclose disability or ask for accommodations, we do not provide them. That is a key difference between high school and college and makes it all the more important that you feel comfortable making appropriate referrals to the DRC. On that note, we really hope that faculty will be comfortable making a general announcement about the DRC within week 1 of class. We have a syllabus statement available for download on our website, as well as a sample script, should you like it, to sort of read out or adapt for your needs about what the Disability Resource Center is and what we do. We have PowerPoint slides, we have flyers. Our numbers, just incidentally, are really skyrocketing in the DRC, and we're sort of catching up to what we would consider to be national best practices, which means that we know that there have been and there probably still are a lot of students out there who could be using this service but aren't, either because they haven't heard about it or because they're looking for a cue from someone they respect, like an instructor, that this is a good idea and something that they should be engaging in. So we really hope that you can emphasize how important it is to seek this kind of help should you need it, and that it's something you support. If a student does disclose disability status, you can definitely refer them to us. They can call, they can email, they can stop by, and we will walk them through the process. And we do ask also that you respect confidentiality. So even if students seem to be open to having this conversation in public, it's generally a good idea to have in a one-on-one setting. In terms of don'ts for appropriate referrals, we don't want to make assumptions about disability status by telling a student we think they have a disability or asking them directly if they have a disability. You can always sort of ask leading questions. We have some sentence starters available on the website that might help you to open the door for the student to disclose. Do not ask for or collect medical documentation, even if a student sort of offers it. Please don't make up accommodations with students outside the DRC process, only because it can start to really get sort of muddy or complicated if one professor is willing to do ad hoc accommodations outside the formal process and another is not. And this is not a time to make comments that are sort of judgmental of the student's situation. So questioning whether a difficult career path would be a good fit for them is inappropriate, or we still have students coming in who tell us that they hear you don't look disabled if they have a non-apparent disability. That can be considered discriminatory, so please don't say it. Okay, and then when it comes to implementing accommodations, a student can send you their letter of accommodation really at any point in the semester. The letters do not expire any longer, so you might find that the letter has an earlier date, effective date on the top. That is fine. We no longer require students to come in semester after semester and ask for the same accommodations. However, it's important to note that while you can receive the accommodation at any point during the semester, accommodations are not retroactive, meaning they're only effective going forward from the time you receive the LOA. So we will have students coming in asking for finals accommodations in week 15, and they could get approved and get those accommodations for finals if we can get it together, but that doesn't mean they're going back and retaking all of their tests they already took with extended time. And at the top of the you'll notice that the disability service specialist's name and contact information is listed. If you have any questions, especially if you have any issues with implementation or if you're concerned about implementation, please contact that person directly or contact our general email or phone number here. When you receive an LOA, as I've said, please don't deny accommodations without contacting the DRC. You can take a moment to think about what you want to say and then respond. Consider what you say. It's a sensitive moment. And really, all you have to say is, thank you for letting me know. Let's set a time to meet and talk It's a good idea for that implementation conversation to be private. You can focus on the accommodations rather than asking a student about specifics of their disability or their diagnosis, which will not be disclosed on the LOA. All you really need to know is not necessarily that student's documentation, though or their disability, though they might share, but rather what their accommodations are and how they might apply in your specific class. You want to clearly express how you and the student will work together to implement the accommodations for your specific class, for your specific curriculum. And then we strongly recommend that you record those expectations or arrangements in writing. This is particularly important for assignment extensions and for attendance deadline flexibility or policy flexibility. It's a great idea if the student sent you that LOA by email to just respond to the email, and then it's in writing to say, you know, thanks for meeting with me. Just to summarize, here's what we spoke about. For example, usually we allow 4 absences before it might affect your attendance grade. Because of your accommodation, I will extend that to 8 for our conversation, for example. So then if there is any conflict or confusion later, you can refer back to that written document. You always engage the DRC. I think I've probably said that about 5 times. I really mean it. You can always engage the DRC to help facilitate that conversation. But if something wasn't meeting, and especially at the beginning of the semester, that's a lot easier for us to help you navigate and the student navigate. And I know this is a lot of text, but I'm sure this PowerPoint will be available later if you want to take a closer look at it. But this is an attempt to kind of break down what the letter is actually asking you to do, because sometimes you might receive an LOA that's a little lengthy, that has several points on it, and we don't want you to feel overwhelmed, especially because there might be some points on there, there's some accommodations on there where the letter isn't really asking you to do anything. It's just an FYI. So we might be letting you know the student is using assistive technology. No action required on your part. It's just so you know. Or that furniture will be available for that student, or that the student may need to take a break. That probably doesn't require a lot of extensive conversation. It's just so you're aware. There might be some accommodations where you have to create a plan with the student, like the absence policy accommodation example that I just gave, or if the student has, let's say, an FM system and they need you to wear a microphone, you might need to come up with a plan for that student, so you know when you're going to get it, when you're going to put it on, where they're going to sit, etc. And there are accommodations that require you to both create a plan with the student and to coordinate with the Disability Resource Center. So a couple examples would be if a student needs alternative format, if they need their materials in audio or braille, for example, you will need to interface with the DRC to get us your course materials so that we can convert them. Same thing goes with captioning. We need all those videos so we can send them out and get them captions and send them back if you do not have captioned versions. And as I mentioned, our most common accommodation, and one that does usually require some interface with the Disability Resource Center, is accessible testing. It is good to agree with the student first whether you will proctor within the department, or, as most instructors choose, you and the student can choose for them to take their test in the DRC and for the DRC to proctor. Next, you're going to want to set times and dates when the student will test with those accommodations, and then the student will schedule a seat with us for those dates. You'll get a confirmation from us, and we would then just ask you to complete the proctor form when you receive the confirmation that the student has scheduled with the DRC. And there is now, we revamped the proctor form, so it's hopefully a little bit more user-friendly. It's available on our website, should take only about 5 minutes, and you can upload a copy of the test at the bottom. Okay, this is just showing where the syllabus statement flyer, PowerPoint slide, and the script are for class announcements. And I want to make sure that everyone is aware of where our online reporting of UIC accessibility issues form is. This is if you encounter any kind of accessibility issue on campus. This is an open form, so sometimes members of the public will fill it out, but we want to make sure that you're aware. Usually it's a facilities issue, but not always, that you can report that both to the and the DRC, and we will immediately work with facilities or whatever stakeholder is necessary to remediate that issue as soon as possible. Great. Well, that's all I had. So now, hopefully, we left ourselves with a little bit of time for questions from the group.
Hello?
thinking there's 10 of you here. We could ask or use the chat box if we're unable to speak verbally. Oh, any questions? And Sophia.
Hello,
Yes, go ahead. I can hear you.
I have a question. Hello.
Go ahead, please.
I would like to pose a hypothetical question. Suppose we have a student who has an involuntary hand movement, like his hand is shaking, and I suppose it's considered a disability. Now the student wants to study in surgery. Should we accept him or not?
So we now, I am thrilled to say, have a dedicated staff member in the Disability Resource Center. Her name is Kimberly Gardner. She'll be working with specifically all of our health sciences students. The reason why we knew that position would be important is because clinical or field work curricula, such as going through our College of Medicine, completing a clerkship in surgery, and then eventually probably moving to the OAE side if you were a resident in surgery. It's a more complicated situation to accommodate than simply sitting in a math class or sitting in an engineering class. Those kinds of programs will have what we call technical standards. They might call them slightly different things, but it's possible that there are certain competencies that someone would have to be able to perform, or certain tasks. Sometimes those are physical tasks, sometimes they are concentration or communication tasks, with or without accommodations, in order to really complete the program and meet those essential elements. So that's a sort of broad answer. When we get into the hypothetical piece, it's really going to depend on that student, right? So is the involuntary hand movement in both of their hands? Is there any kind of adaptive or assistive technology that we could provide? Have we been in consultation with the clerkship director for surgery to see if they are actually able to make it through that program? And I think you specified in the hypothetical that surgery is what they want to study, what they want to major in, or their concentration.
Yeah. The thing is that are we allowed to put a patient in danger by allowing a person with such disability to study a surgery and become a surgeon? Maybe, maybe he can complete his studies, but when the time of surgery comes, who can guarantee that he can perform the surgery? No, I don't want to continue with that because I have a real question. That was just the preparation. I have an international student who misses classes and also has performed very badly in the exam. He has brought a letter from your center. He has brought a letter from your center saying that she has dizziness and she needs to be accommodated. Now she tells me that she feels dizzy when she's sitting. She feels dizzy when she walks. She feels dizzy when she reads. She feels dizzy most of the time. Well, we of course we feel sorry for her, but isn't it a condition that the student should mention when applying? Because she's missing most of the lectures, and as I said, she's not performing well in the exams. This means that she's not able to really learn what she's supposed to from a course. And other than telling the instructor to, well, that's of course one option to tell the instructor to be accommodating. But if it's not working, do you also consider to tell the student to take one semester leave of absence and try to deal with her condition so that she can start the next term or semesters with the high efficiency. Do you consider that situation?
You know, a lot of encounter health conditions or get diagnosed while they're in school. So it's very possible that that person was unaware that this would cause so many challenges or didn't have this condition when they started. And ultimately, we can't guarantee a student's success. That's one of the reasons why I mentioned the high school versus college paradigm, right? So if we're accommodating a student and they're still not coming to any of their classes, they're failing their exams, they're not turning in their homework, it's not the DRC's role to say, no, but you must pass the student, they have a disability. If they are in an equal access situation and they're not passing, then maybe it's a good idea for them in consult with the DRC, probably in consult with their advisor, to talk about what are my best options here. This isn't working for me. Even with reasonable accommodations, I'm still failing my classes. Maybe something like a leave of absence would be a good idea. But it really is case by case. And I see what you're saying, that it can be frustrating when you're doing everything that you can and someone's still just in a situation where their health is not allowing them to perform to the best of their ability.
Mind, whether or an employee.
I understand. What I just want to recommend is that while I understand that you sincerely try to help students, and that's our job too, we should be compassionate and uh, helpful to students to pass this university education satisfactorily. Uh, there are always chances that people take advantage of, your trust, especially people who may also be receiving some kind of financial support. Because I understand that even that some undergraduate students, the international ones, are receiving money from the university. So I think maybe in the application process there should be clauses that specifically ask them if they have any health conditions that may prevent them from fully taking advantage of this opportunity that many other students are applying for and only a few will get. So,
Just on the front end, I just want to make sure that hear me saying that there's an extensive review that goes into, these students and employees, right? That's why we have these processes in place to be sure that they are being granted a reasonable accommodation to help them either perform the essential functions of the job or to do well in the academic setting. But if they don't do well in the academic setting, right, then that's really, that's where the creative minds start to come together about, well, should we really think about a leave of absence? And I agree that I think that's exactly where one would go. But understand that if they're not doing well and they're not succeeding, you can engage in a conversation to see if they need some time away from the program, and that might be very, very helpful to the student. But at the end of the day, right, they still have to be able to do well and pass. The idea of these laws and these processes is not to give them an advantage over others, but that they have an equal playing field to be given an accommodation to have equal access to their education and their environment.
thank you very much.
I just wanted to make sure, see if from the group. I think this is very fruitful. I just wanted to open it up to the other participants. Any other questions from the group? We're happy to continue the conversation with the other questions. I just wanted to make sure everybody has a chance to share their thoughts. No? All right, well then I'll flip it back. So you had another question, sir? I can't unfortunately see your name. It just says owner. Did you want to continue asking questions? You can unmute.
Well, no, that was my only concern. No, nothing else. Yeah, there was one thing.
You know, if I could,
When I
you know what?
when I received the,
That work. Karen, just want to make a quick point and then we'll come back to your question. Hold on one
Sure.
second. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So to your point about the surgery, I just wanted to be sure that I wanted to share a really quick real life situation where we had a dental student who had one hand, okay, and so as an applicant, so safety and technical viewed very, very carefully. Right? And then, of course, you know, it would be temptation, right? But what alternative that person became founded research and ended up doing some really phenomenal work, studying dental degree, but becoming a researcher in the field. So just wanted to point that out that there are always possible alternatives. Look at these situations on a case by case.
I recall that you mentioned something about sort of applications or disclosure during the application process. And I do want to clarify that there is sort of a difference between ensuring that students can meet technical standards for a specific program to which they are applying, a selective enrollment program, and requiring students to disclose disability upfront in the applications process. So we have to be very careful in the latter sort of situation that we are not forcing students to disclose any sort of disability status up front because it could be construed as a discriminatory measure. We should not be considering their disability status, but merely their aptitude, you know, the other things that they look at for undergrad admits, their ACT scores, their GPA, their essay, as opposed to whether or not they have disability to determine whether or not they get in. So I just want to clarify that the technical standards are not sort of a blanket by which we can say, oh, because of your tremor or because of your situation, your chronic health condition, we speculate that you wouldn't be able to make it as an undergrad, so we're not admitting you to the college. You know, we have a pretty open admissions process, so and whether or not a student has a disability is not a determining factor. We have about 2 more minutes. Questions from the audience for our presenters. And Sophia. Feel free to use the chat box too. If not, we'd like to thank, I know, we want to thank Caryn and Sophia for their time today. We really appreciate it. This is very informative. Thank you also for your questions. Thank you very much, all. Have a great afternoon. Excellent.